It's not about networking, it's about relationship building. And those are two very distinct things, right? You can meet someone and have a connection, but that is not a relationship.
Welcome back to 40-Minute Mentor, the podcast on a mission to raise aspirations and inspire the next generation of category-defining founders, all in just 40 minutes. Today, we're joined by not just one, but two 40-Minute Mentors as we take a deep dive into the world of platform in VC. We're joined by Leah Sutton, Chief Portfolio Talent Officer at Balderton, and Charlotte van Reyk, VP of Platform at Lightspeed. Over the next 40-odd minutes or so, we'll discuss both of their incredible careers to date, hear about their route into VC, demystify what a platform role actually is, and we'll also pick their brains on the ever-changing VC landscape. So, Charlotte and Leah, a massive welcome to the podcast. Thank you both for being here. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks, James. Glad to be here.
Awesome.
Thanks for having us.
The pleasure is all mine.
On a dreary, dreary Friday.
I know it's chucking it down with rain outside, which is not ideal. But spirits are high. It's the end of the week, and you both have incredible roles and have had incredible careers. So I am super excited to dive into all of that. But before we do, for anyone that doesn't know you, we're going to give you some quick fire questions to get to know you a bit better. So Leah, we'll start with you. Can you finish the following sentences after me? Success means to me
being able to live with my family in a healthy and happy way. And I think ultimately it comes down to health and happiness with my family.
It's brilliant. That was very wholesome.
Yeah.
That's how we need to start. I like that. The best day in my career to date was when?
I mean, I don't know if it's the best, but I think the most memorable was probably standing on the balcony at the New York Stock Exchange when Elastic went public. That's definitely one for the memory books.
Yes. Not many people can say that. So I would love to do that one day.
Turns out it's terrifyingly small.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting. Okay, that's a great one. One piece of advice I'd give to my younger self is?
Don't get too wrapped up in having a plan. I think that's definitely, I had no plan. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have expected I'd be where I am. So I think you never know where life's going to take you. So just be open.
Given your CV, that is very reassuring for anyone listening at the moment that might not know exactly where they're going. My biggest failure to date is?
I mean, I think professionally, probably being in a situation, as a leader in a company where we had to have a massive global RIF and let go of, 400 really exceptional people. And that's one that will hurt for a long time.
Yeah, and that's the worst thing about being in people leadership roles, I guess, when you have to do that at scale. Oh, I can imagine that was an incredibly stressful experience. Well, thank you for sharing. We're going to come to you now, Charlotte. Same questions. Success means to me?
Well, mine sounds a little mercenary after Leah's, but I'd say doing a job you love 90% of the time. I feel like that's incredibly important given 80% of your week or maybe more spent working.
Very good one. The best day in my career to date was when?
It's a tough one, but I have to say it's probably when I had my company, when I signed my first client. That was a pretty momentous day. It kind of made me feel excited about what the future held.
Yeah. Validation of why you went out on your own. It's such a great moment. I completely agree with that. A piece of advice you'd give your younger self is?
I'd say that's an interesting question, actually, as a mother who's got a child about to start in year 4. I'd say, keep going, take the pressure off. Like Leah said as well, try and enjoy learning. It's really hard, but I think enjoying it and getting a bit more out of it and just slowing down a bit.
Yeah, I love that. As somebody that I think in the early years of JBM, I didn't enjoy anywhere near as much of it as I should have because I was so stressed about keeping the wheels on the track. I think there's a lot to that, and particularly when it comes to family as well. So thank you for sharing. And finally, what's the biggest failure?
It depends how you define failure, right? But I'd say if I was thinking about where I am now, I was very fortunate to be moved to California with Google to work in the head office in 2019. And I think I'll always slightly regret we came back too quickly. It was COVID, personal circumstances, which obviously were the right reasons. But there'll always be a niggle of regret that we didn't stay there longer.
Well, thank you both so much. And we're going to dive straight into careers and life. But before we get too far down the track, let's talk about your upbringing and how that shaped the people you are today and the leaders that you are. So, Charlotte, do you mind sharing a bit about your early life and, the impact that it has had on you?
Yeah, of course. So I think probably one of the most defining characteristics that I would say that has sort of led me on in life is I was a girl between two boys, a middle child. Middle child syndrome, I don't know if either of you are familiar with that, but it's definitely...
Yeah, I'm a middle child.
Okay, so you know what it feels like. It was quite a vibrant household. I was often caught up between wrestling matches and always tried my best to win where I could. My parents both studied law, so had pretty vocational sort of starts, but actually super entrepreneurial and liked to experiment with a lot of things, sometimes failing, sometimes being successful. So there was a real spirit of definitely competitiveness, but also achieving. And actually, I would say, like, hand on heart, they were quite pushy. Like, they really pushed us to get the best possible results we could and actually, like, really focus at school and do the best we could. I think there was a real focus on doing the best. As long as you did your best, that was great. And so I think that's what influenced me to study law at university and then go on to take the Deloitte graduate scheme, which was amazing, for better or worse.
Nice. Thank you very much. What about you, Leah? How was your upbringing and how's that shaped the person you are today?
I mean, I am definitely the oldest child. So I think there's like the classic. I grew up in a pretty small town in rural northern Minnesota. So for those listeners who are not familiar with the geography of the US, kind of central northern United States, practically Canada. We always joke that we were half Canadian. And it was a really small town. And, growing up was sort of pre-internet, pre-access to the wider world. And I was fortunate, this seems a bit random. I mean, my parents were incredibly supportive, and I was fortunate to go to language camp when I was little. And that gave me, that was the only way I sort of got exposed to, I went to French camp and I got exposed to all these people from all over the world, our counselors, and I got really intrigued. And we always had in my we had a large rural high school exchange students. So there were people from all over the world that I'm sure when they, had dreams of coming to America, Bemidji, Minnesota was not sort of where they imagined they might land. They're sort of thinking New York or California. But it really intrigued me to do something bigger and different. And so I actually took a gap year, which was highly unusual in 1991, and lived in South Africa. And everyone thought my parents had lost their minds to let their daughter go off to Cape Town. Anywhere really, but Cape Town in particular. I think that was just so exotic at the time. And that just really changed kind of the course of it. So for me, it's really about having a family who supported. They still we're like, we don't know how you sort of turned out how you did, because most of my family is still back in Minnesota. But I think just having that support and sort of curiosity about the wider world got triggered when I was, probably 10, 12 years old. And here we are.
Incredible.
I have to say, those exchange programs are terrifying at the time, but probably so character forming.
For sure.
We could have a whole nother conversation on those, I'm sure.
Wow. We've tapped into something here.
Oh, definitely. And especially kind of time. Now it's different, right? The world is so connected and global. But I talk to my parents once a month for 15 minutes. And
yes, we didn't have mobile phones. You couldn't text. Yeah, no, totally.
Wow, that's amazing. And it just goes to show how formative certain experiences can be and how it can change the path of life and actually open so many doors. So I love both those answers. And it sounds like very supportive parents on both sides, which is, I feel very lucky to have been in the same situation. Although I now wish I'd have gone on a language camp. I'm kicking myself and I'll have words with them next time I see them. Well, Charlotte, your career, you've built your own business, which you alluded to. You joined Google. Now you're in VC. This is a really varied career journey. So do you mind sharing some of the kind of standout, memorable moments from it?
Yeah, totally. And it's funny, we should say, sliding doors. I was thinking about this and there were quite a few sliding door moments. I mentioned earlier that I joined Deloitte. I was very lucky after my summer internship to get a role at Deloitte on their corporate tax scheme. I'd loved my internship. I got seconded to a big tech company. And this might sound strange, but I got really excited because when I was seconded there, we saved them millions of pounds of VAT. And actually that instantly felt like I was making an impact. So I was really energized and excited about that. So I took the role without maybe realizing that simultaneously whilst working, I'd be studying bookkeeping. And I actually walked out of my early bookkeeping exam, which got me disqualified. So that was kind of a sliding doors moment, because had I not done that and had, it could have been the change, it was basically decided for me. So I had to very quickly get a job, and I joined a small family office, which really was the inspiration to start my company. Before I started university to sort of earn money, I worked in a friend's shop. And actually, she and her husband now have 10 stores around the UK. And when I was thinking about starting my company, they sat down with me. They helped me write my business plan, design my logo, came up with a name to make things happen. And without them, I really wouldn't have had the self-belief at 23 to go out and build a business, to hire people, to go and meet clients. Often I had to lie about my age, which kind of feels weird now because I quite like to lie about my age now. But I got to travel the world. I got to meet incredibly successful and diverse entrepreneurs. And really no day was ever the same. And I never knew what was coming. So it was a complete roller coaster ride. And I did that for 7 years. And during that time, I guess I met, when we're thinking about this, the name of this podcast, I met my next mentor. And he really inspired me to join Google. I kind of really felt like I needed to grow, and running my company just wasn't going to be possible. And it was an incredible opportunity. And I remember the first day I walked into the Google office in Covent Garden, and I really couldn't believe that this was my life. Similarly, when I got asked to move to Google in Mountain View, as I mentioned earlier, and working with a leadership team, it was really a once in a lifetime opportunity. And actually, I'm sure you're familiar with the film Apprenticeship. It really felt like walking into a film set, the Noogler hat spinning on the head. I felt so privileged. And I know it sounds super cheesy, but every single day that I turned up at that campus, it was quite extraordinary. As a Brit and growing up in rural England, Mountain View is quite a different world.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's amazing. What experiences. And what would you say were your biggest lessons that you learned from either time as a founder or at Google?
Honestly, and I'd say this translates in my life today, is staying one step ahead. When I was running my business, failure wasn't an option. I had mouths to feed, quite literally. I was paying bills and I had employees that were reliant on me paying their salary every month. So I constantly had to think each quarter, 6 months, 12 months ahead, and constantly plan ahead. My margins were small, but I really, really wanted to succeed. And I wanted to be able to reward the people who are working really, really hard for me. And honestly, at Google, Google's a massive corporation now, but in those days it was smaller. But also, it was super important, even though I was working in marketing and it was a cost center, constantly being one step ahead. When you're working with such senior leadership teams, you constantly need to be thinking and being proactive and thinking of things before they do. So I would say always getting one step ahead is absolutely critical and really translates into my role today.
Oh, no, and that's a perfect segue. I wanted to find out how those various experiences have helped you in your role today in VC. How have they translated and crossed over?
Yeah. So, funny enough, actually, one leader at Google always used to say, act like an owner and think like an entrepreneur. And that quite literally is what I'm doing today. Working with founders and their teams, I've walked in their shoes. I've been an operator. I've been a founder. I really can empathize. And empathy, I think, is absolutely critical. I think the best investors, and hopefully, Leah, you'll agree with this here, when you're thinking about hiring and talent, you have to have empathy. You have to understand the hurdles, the roller coaster rides. It's kind of endless. And it never, even when you win that first client, you win that first customer, you've got to win the next one. You've got to retain them. You've got to sustain it. So I'd say empathy is critical.
Yeah, it's a great answer, and it's so true. It's so true, and you can really see the best investors, the best VCs, the best platform leaders I've seen have got that in their absolute spades, and it's so reassuring, I think, for founders to have someone that kind of is in their corner and really supports them and really kind of can relate. And that's a great segue, Leah, to talk about your experience. You've led global HR and people functions. You've worked in hyper growth companies. Do you mind sharing a bit more about your experience, and particularly where your passion for people and HR comes from?
Yeah, it's not an obvious path, I think, if you've looked at my LinkedIn. But I mean, I just first it's violent agreement with the idea of empathy. And I think perhaps without realizing that's what it was, I think that's something that's really driven kind of the choices I've made and sort of where I've gotten to career-wise. But the sort of passion for people in HR, it's not like I woke up when I was graduating from university, I was like, I'm going to go do HR. In actual fact, I went and I lived out in 2-room mud hut in a tiny village in West Africa. So it wasn't exactly an obvious thing. And I always like to frame it as I'm a business person. I just happen to really love the people aspect of business because it's incredibly strategic. It's incredibly important. And it really drives your success. Ultimately, if you don't have the right people, around the table and in a company and aren't managing them well and thinking about how do we, make all these pieces work together, it won't work. And I think that can't be underestimated and can't be undervalued. I talked to a newer founder recently. He's like, man, hiring is really hard. I hate it. I'm like, buckle up, buddy. That's what you're going to be focused on. That is literally your most important job for now and, forever kind of thing. But I came into it, I think I came into the HR piece a bit sideways. And so I was reflecting a little bit on this question. And if I think about the things that I've done, I sort of did Peace Corps after uni. And Peace Corps, again, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a 2-year, it's a service organization sponsored by the United States government where you go and work in communities volunteering effectively for just over 2 years. And I was an agriculture volunteer in a tiny village in Mali in West Africa. And it was more about, I think it was like that. And then I went to a startup when I moved to DC after that. And that was sort of my first taste of startups. But it was, it was adventure travel. It was like a really kind of random thing where a couple of my buddies were at. And then I went to business school. And business school, I was like, I'm going to go do good in the world, do social enterprise, do this or that. But then I got an internship with Deloitte. And I'm like, Charlotte.
Oh, did you?
I did, yeah. I went to Deloitte after business school, and I was like, whoa, I've got student loans, and this is this amazing experience. It was pretty clear to me pretty quickly that, I wasn't going to be a lifelong consultant, but I happened to get staffed on a human capital project. And that was sort of my first taste of kind of the people side of things. And it wasn't sort of HR-ish, it was more project management, but that led to an experience where a friend of mine was like, hey, we need someone doing people stuff at this startup. And it was Bloom Energy, which is no longer a startup. It's, it's a large public energy company. But I sort of leapt and I was like, sure, I can do people stuff, not knowing at all what that was. And it was, it was recruiting, staffing, which I got out of really quickly because I've never been great at that. But I just loved it. And I loved being involved in all aspects of the business. And I had an extraordinary mentor there who joined about 6 months after I did, who came into lead HR and was like, thank God this person's here. I know nothing about HR. And so I really, he just let me run and really sort of guided. And I think the thing about HR at the end of the day is, again, I had that business hat on. You can learn the HR pieces of it, but you have to have that empathy. And I think if you are a strategic thinker, but really love the people side of it, it's a great place to be because ultimately that's how you build a business, right? Is through your people. So I think all of these different things, then from Bloom, I went to, I spent 18 months in Bangalore, and a little bit like, Charlotte's opportunity, like, hey, we'd like to move you to Mountain View. It's like, hey, what do you think about India? And I was like, okay. And at the time I had a 14-month-old, and my husband was like, yeah, I'll quit my job. And off we went to Bangalore with a toddler and had this really extraordinary experience. And it was sort of wild, wild west in a way because we didn't really know it was happening. And we had 250 people there. It was not a small operation. And then from there, I came back and went to a baby food, startup that was a high growth startup that got acquired by a big old US corporate called Campbell's Soup. And a lot of people, will be familiar with like the Campbell's Soup logo. And then from there went to Elastic, which is where I spent, prior to coming to Balderton, almost 8 years. So there's sort of this thread around building and high growth and sort of a very global nature. And so I think for me, the thread is fairly obvious, but if you just sort of look at it on paper, it doesn't feel obvious. But I'm a builder. And so I think that, those pieces, and I'm also, I would say resilience is probably an overarching characteristic. Like I'm not scared of hard. And I think that is something that's really important. If you're an entrepreneur in an entrepreneurial sort of setting, like you have to have that ability to flex and to flow and not get knocked over by the first problem that comes along. And so I think that's something that has been this thread that I think about. I'm like, yeah, I can manage that, right? Like I could manage living without electricity for 2 years. Like this isn't that hard. Like I can figure this out, So I think that resilience is something I value and sort of try to bring to and encourage people to build.
Such an important part of being in this ecosystem as well. And again, I think that also relates to empathy because you need deep reserves of resilience as a founder to go the course. So again, I can you can instantly see how, but with both of your backgrounds, it's so relatable to founders. Leah, in terms of Elastic, that is a hyper growth company that I know you just did some incredible things with. So what were some of the standout moments from that experience? And also, I'd love also to hear about any really gnarly, challenging parts of that as well.
There was plenty of gnarly. I think that the last 3 years of my experience there with COVID and sort of then, like massive growth and then massive reduction, I think all of that sort of that whole 3-year bucket. But it was one of those journeys. So I joined Elastic, I think Series C, and then very quickly Series. So we probably 25 million in revenue and about 250 people in 13 countries. And when I left, we were 3,200 people. We just hit $1 billion in revenue and we're in 40 odd countries. So it was just this very extraordinary. So I remember when we had the first 500 people and then the first 1,000 people, and you sort of have these milestones that you celebrate, and the first 100 million and the first, and so it's just kind of this I mean, I feel incredibly fortunate to have had that experience. But when I showed up, I was like, wow, I'm a terrible interviewer. Like, there was no HR team. I had like 2 recruiters, a coordinator, and director of recruiting. I was like, man, I asked the wrong questions. So just going back to that kind of resilience and just being able to, push and not, I'm a grinder at the end of the day, and I know what that feels like. And I'm not afraid of that. And I think that's something that's led me to kind of this series of entrepreneurial things. But those moments of hard, you have to get through them. And I think when COVID hit, I mean, I just remember being on the phone with my CEO, and he's like, what should we do? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I've never managed a global pandemic before. It was just like this extraordinary moment where I think every HR leader at the time was like, holy moly, like, what do we do here? And we figured it out. And it was terrible. I mean, it was really, truly terrible. And, trying to, fortunately, touch wood, we didn't lose any employees from COVID. We lost employees, elsewhere during my tenure, but it was just really hard. And I think having to flex in a way, and Elastic was distributed before we even had words for what a hybrid company was, right? We had people, I think at that point, in 30 countries. So COVID was happening in very different ways in very different places, and having to react to that as a company when the leadership is looking to you as a people leader to say, hey, what do we need to do? And you've got no context, and there's not like, you can't call anyone and say, hey, like, what are you doing here? And in actual fact, we called it my little HR cabal, and we ended up meeting weekly. And it started as kind of a dinner, like a quarterly dinner party thing, but it very quickly morphed into like keeping each other sane during COVID. And it was leaders from, Asana and Lyft and Dropbox and Slack, that community. Like we just sort of like, what are you doing for this? What are you doing for that? And then there was the social unrest in the US. It was just like the hits kept coming, I think, from an HR perspective. And it was tough. But at the same time, business was really good. So we hired 1,500 people in the course of like 12 months. And so we grew really fast. And then when the sort of wheels came off of the economy, 18 months later, we had to reduce. And so it was just a really wild, I think, hard journey. But there's a lot of lessons there that I will certainly carry with me forever, and I think are very, helpful as I do my job today at Balderton.
Just a quick one from me before we hear more pocket-sized mentorship from today's 40-minute mentor. This episode is brought to you by Foundation Partners, the embedded people function service that scales from inception to growth. Foundation Partners have been the go-to partner for over 200 leaders globally who want to create high-performing teams and companies through aligning your people strategy with your business strategy. Alongside JBM and Unleashed, Foundation Partners is also part of Amplified Group, the people services supergroup that supports tech companies from inception all the way to IPO. To find out more about Foundation Partners, head over to www.foundationpartners.co.uk or get in touch with people at foundationpartners.co.uk. Now, back to today's 40-minute mentor. We've mentioned mentorship a couple of times on this. Both of you have mentioned mentorship and great mentors, but also peer mentorship. Sometimes in the hardest moments, looking to your peers in different organizations is so important. And I found that myself as a founder. Probably some of the most important connections I have are founders of other search firms or other companies. And nobody should be an island. I think it's really important to get that support. Just coming back to you, Charlotte, then, what have been some of the most challenging parts of your career, and what has helped you get through the difficult moments?
I mean, I think, interestingly, what I just said, a lot of it really resonates, especially COVID and the challenge during COVID. And I was thinking about this question, and it's like, it could go one way or the other. But I would say, honestly, for me to date, and this is where I think mentorship is utterly critical in today's society, even more so with so much pressure. I would say when I had my first child was probably the biggest hurdle I encountered, pregnancy, because mentally you change when you're growing a child and you're still working. And you also feel like maybe are people treating you differently because they know you're going to go out on leave. I was very, very lucky that I worked for Google in the UK at the time, and the UK's maternity policy is pretty incredible. I took a year out, and I think what, for me, the biggest change and the biggest challenge, I want to say, is that I was really ambitious. I wanted to go back to work, and I wanted to throw myself in, and I wanted to deliver. But I had another human that was relying on me. I couldn't stay in the office till really late. I couldn't get in as early as I wanted. And not just that, like my self-esteem was really, really impacted. there's a different piece of yourself that's you kind of change as a mother and as a dad for sure. But I think what got me through at Google was I had so many people that had done it, and the community around, to have the empathy, to kind of the resilience. I think resilience is absolutely critical, because often you're not sleeping through the night, but you've got to go to work and you've got to show your best self. And you also don't want to bring that to the office. But equally, you also have this other thing in your head of going, am I being a good mother? Am I being a good parent? And I can't tell you I've overcome that hurdle. And it didn't get any easier when I had my second child. I actually had my second child in the US during the pandemic. So that was a whole different story. But I think there's always a niggle in your head of where's the trade-off happening? And I think I know often where my trade-off happens. And if you interviewed my kids, they tell you where the trade-off happens. But it's about going back to your very first question you asked me, like, what does success look like? And I think that's why you have to love what you do. You have to love the people you surround yourself with, but you have to be inspired, you have to be energized, and you have to be excited by them. And honestly, that's what helped me overcome those challenges during that big life change. And I was very fortunate, as I said, that both of those happened during my time at Google.
Oh, thank you for sharing.
I could not agree with that more, just in terms of that, like, you have to really, like, it is a trade-off, and it's really hard. And by the way, it doesn't get easier as they get older. I have a 14-year-old and it's still really hard. But I think when you are able to have people around you that have gone through that experience, but also, sort of, I think Charlotte and I are very similar like this. Like, we love what we do and we're very passionate about our careers. And so when your kids see that and understand that that's something that fills you up and makes you a whole person, I think that's also really powerful. And I love when James like, yeah, mom's really good at her job, or she really loves her job. It's like, that makes me really proud, right? Because that's important too.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Thank you both for sharing. I think that will really resonate with a lot of our audience. And actually, it's really important to talk about these things. So thank you for that. We've got to come on to talk about VC, because that is a big part of why we're here. And you both work for incredible funds. So I'd love to know how you ended up in the industry and why you ended up at Balderton and Lightspeed, respectively. So, Leah, why don't you start us off? Tell us a bit about how you ended up in London at such a great fund.
I mean, I really have to attribute it to a sneaky recruiter. I wasn't looking. I mean, I had at that point when I first got connected with Balderton, I'd been at Elastic about 6.5 years and was definitely exhausted, having just sort of turned the corner on COVID. And I happened to be in London for a work/family trip, and a recruiter that I had used to recruit for me at Elastic in Europe pinged me and was like, hey, we should catch up. And I, thinking that they were wanting to hear about opportunities at Elastic, was like, give me a call, I'm in town. And lo and behold, that was not what they wanted to talk to me about. So I had not heard of Balderton, but very quickly, got connected and was like, sure, I'll have a conversation. And the first conversation I had, I was like, uh-oh. I was in London and I was then going to India for work. And I called my husband. I was like, do you remember when I called you? And I was like, what would you think about India? I was like, I think we need to think about London, because I was just so compelled by the conversations that I had with the first couple of partners that I met. And I'd always wanted, frankly, was feeling a little bit itchy because I'd been in the Bay Area for 20 years, minus the 18 months in India. And it was time for another adventure. Thought that I would live in Europe with Elastic because it was such a global company and it was a European founded company. That just didn't work out for a whole host of reasons. And so I got super excited. I love London. I'd spent a lot of time here. I had a big team here. So the conversation started, and then, we had our big riff at Elastic, and I was...
Yeah, what did they do that was so compelling?
I don't know. It was just... So going back to building, I got really intrigued by the idea of a one-to-many impact versus a one-to-one impact. So if I can help dozens of founders versus one founder, that was really exciting to me. And particularly given that Balderton's a generalist investor, and I've always been in venture-backed companies, pretty much, except for Deloitte, so I was sort of on the other side of it. And I had relationships with the talent partners. I knew what that looked like. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. But I felt like there's an opportunity to build something new and different. And so I got really excited about the build and really excited about London. And so a year later, here I am. Well, 2 years later now, I guess I've been in London for a year. So
yeah, well, I remember meeting you relatively early into the experience.
Right away, you were one of the first people I met. Yeah, for sure.
And it was just I thought what a brilliant hire they've made, but also just I love the boldness of how it had come about, and just it's been awesome to see the impact you've had. I'm glad you made the move.
Me too. It doesn't feel very bold relative to other places I've landed. So I was like, London's easy. Everyone speaks English. But I think for a lot of people that it might seem a little crazy.
Yeah, London, Mali, Bangalore. It's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Charlotte, what about you? How did you end up at Lightspeed?
So firstly, I wanted to comment there. What I love is that, and what strength it shows about the European venture ecosystem, because Leah came from the Silicon Valley to London to work in venture capital, which I think is a real statement in itself. And I think it really shows how exciting. And I know we're talking about that in a minute, but I just think it shows how vibrant the venture capital ecosystem is right now. Honestly, I think I've always loved working with founders and entrepreneurs, like right from the start. That's why I did what I did and why I started my company. And I was like basically working with founders on a daily basis then. And then working with the Google leadership team, they were, super entrepreneurial as well. But when I moved back to London, my role was very much still in the US, and I was working on an 8-hour time difference. And I did that for 2 years because I loved it, but it was really hard to sustain. And I had always had this kind of real interest in working in VC and working more closely with founders again. And I was really lucky to be introduced to the managing partner of Europe, who was kind of rebuilding. And to Leah's point, it's like building out Europe and being part of the founding team here. Having worked for such a big brand, a global brand, I really, really wanted to work with the right people. And what really struck me was the authenticity, the humility, and the clear sense of purpose. And so many of the investors at Lightspeed have been founders themselves. And back to that, resilience, empathy, like I really felt like I could have a really natural conversation with them. And I really felt like they would like a true willingness to roll up their sleeves and like get in the trenches with founders, which was really inspirational. And that carried through in each conversation. I met multiple investors at Lightspeed, both in the UK and Europe, and then in California. And I actually couldn't believe some of the people that I met had never met before or encountered during my time there, because they were really, I think that says a lot about them, right? Because they were the humility. They weren't necessarily the most well-known individuals, but collectively what they were doing was super impressive.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. There are going to be people listening to this that want to replicate your move into VC, into a platform role. So I'd love to hear, Leah, we'll come to you first. One, the kind of misconceptions perhaps about the role, the things that might have surprised you since you've been in it, but also give them some tangible advice about how they might be able to make that move, because it is a relatively mystical world, not the easiest to crack. So yeah, we'd love to hear your experience with those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, and Charlotte and I've certainly talked about this too, that's really interesting, like every firm does it differently, right? So what platform means, what talent means, how they bucket it, how they think about it, firm to firm looks very different. And so just practically speaking, I think understanding what different firms, what their approach is. And some firms, they are actively recruiting for the portfolio. So they take a very hands-on sort of operational, sort of stance. We don't do that. And I was really clear with Balderton. I was like, listen, a lot of my peers come from exec search. I've never been a recruiter. I mean, I had sort of a brief kind of pretend stint at Bloom. I'm just not good at it. It's not I'm a generalist in the truest sense of the word from an operational perspective. So I was really trying to ensure that that wasn't the expectation. Like I'm not, talent is obviously paramount when you're starting to build a company, but how you go about getting that talent, and sort of getting connected from your venture partner is different firm to firm. And so I think once we just sort of established, like, I'm not going to be doing executive recruiting, then things fell into place. So I think one thing is really understand, like, what is the, sort of look and feel, like, how do firms approach it? Making sure if there's like someone you're targeting or thinking about it, hey, this is what I bring to the table. I think operational experience is something that's really powerful, because at the end of the day, you're in a very kind of consultative advisory role. And when you're talking to founders, if you're not directly recruiting or helping with talent, having something to offer where you've done something operational, whether it's business development or sales or HR, I think that can be really powerful. But you have to understand kind of what's the hook, right? And some firms are focused on, hey, we really want to help our founders find their first customers, right? And help them close customers. That's not a focus of Balderton, right? We don't focus on that commercial aspect of it. So if that's your, that's what you do, this isn't the right place. And so I think really think about what are those skills that you have. And to be honest, like talent is a massive one, right? So a recruitment background, you've got that background, but I also think it is very consultative. So if you've been in kind of, hey, I just do very tactical recruiting, that's probably not the right fit. And I think further, and I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, like it's not going to be satisfying to you as well, because I think there is this, how do you measure value, and how do you sort of, like, when you're in an operational role for a long time, and you're used to just doing and executing and sort of delivery all the time, we're building for the long term, right? VCs have a 10-year time horizon. They're thinking long term. And so when you think about how you build a platform, you also have to have both this kind of short term, hey, we can help you in the moment, but what are we building and trying to support over the long term? So I think having both a sort of short term but also long term mindset helps. But really thinking tactically about what are those operational skills that you have is important.
That's great advice. Charlotte, any advice you'd give to anyone looking to make a move into VC?
I actually think the comment that I just made on that this is a long game. You mentioned misconception, and like full transparency, before I really delve deep, I think often people think on the outside that VC is about chasing the next big thing, finding the next big company that's going to go public, that's going to IPO, that's going to be acquired. But actually, it's not about making quick money. It's about the long game and requires a lot of patience. And it's about deep relationships, which is honestly why I love it, because I love relationship building and a real commitment to the founders to help them succeed. So I'd say that as Leah said, I get to know the funds. I'd be proactive. I think it's incredibly competitive, but I'd be proactive and really find the right fund that really leans into your strengths too. I think, as you said, like most VCs don't actually actively recruit and have open roles. So I think it's really on you. And I also think like really keeping a very open mind, but also like thinking about founders come first. If the founders are successful, the firm's successful. So that founder first mindset is absolutely critical.
That's great advice.
I just want to like add on the relationship thing. I mean, or emphasize rather, like it's not, when you think about, you'll talk about network, it's not about networking, it's about relationship building. And those are two very distinct things, right? You can meet someone and have a connection, but that is not a relationship. And I think it's not transactional. And I think that's super important to understand. So if like I have a million LinkedIn connections, but how many relationships do you have and how do you think about your relationships it's absolutely paramount.
I'm so glad you said that, because that is at the absolute heart of our business. That's exactly why I created it. I was so fed up of how transactional recruitment is. And it's kind of goes to the heart of why I love what I do, because it's about building those deeper connections. And off the back of that, beautiful things will happen. So love that. Every role in platform is different. So we should probably talk about actually what day-to-day looks like for you. So Leah, tell us a bit about that. And I'd love to hear particularly about what are the benefits for founders that work with platform leaders like yourself, and how does that manifest itself on a sort of day-to-day basis?
I think, at Balderton, there's a couple things that are unique about what I do. One, I think just because of my background, I've got that operational background, but day-to-day varies, right? Some days you have a lot of conversations and some days you don't. And, I think a lot of what Shannon and I do, I've got a team of one, it's connecting the dots. So I think about our job as like, hey, we are trying to connect the dots for people. And whether that is recommending an exec search firm or helping someone think through a problem or meeting a great potential chief product officer, like those are all very different activities, but it's at the end of the day being helpful. And so we always say, how can I ask the question, like, how can I help, right? Whether I'm talking to a founder or talking to a potential candidate that I meet, because it isn't transactional. So even if I meet someone that there's nothing available in the portfolio, nor will there probably ever be, I still want to be able to add value to them, because going back to it's a long game, you never know when they're going to know someone who connects, it's a small world. And so it's about being helpful. So day to day, it's, I would say, maybe a third advisory, a third sort of thinking long term, a third just sort of like tactically making sure you're connecting the dots. It turns out there's like about 1 million recruiters out there that want to have a chat. So talk to a lot of your peers. But I think the other thing that's unique about Balderton is I help support our founder well-being and performance platform. So thinking about, long term, from a support perspective, what does that look like? So making sure our founders get connected with our well-founded program, making sure I'm maintaining and building relationships with great executive coaches, thinking about what are new things we could add into that platform that are what's going to be meaningful to our founders from a support perspective over time. So we recently added a parenting support tool for not just founders that are moms, but any founder who's a parent who needs additional parental support. So I was thinking about kind of both the short term, kind of what are those connections that need to be made today, tomorrow, next week, but also long term, how do we continue to build value for our founders in the portfolio?
Yeah, I love how holistic that is, from very tactical, whether it's introductions to search firms, to much longer term well-being related. I guess it just shows the importance of supporting in every sense and really being in their corner for the long term, which is obviously a word that keeps coming up, but I think is so important. Charlotte, I guess coming to you, what does your role look like day to day? And again, same question around how you work with founders.
And I think what's super interesting is that titles kind of can mean everything and nothing, because I think what you said, Leah, there, being helpful is definitely like a common thread, whatever your role is, I think, in venture, because you're working with founders and you really want to be helpful to them. So my role has a global remit. And honestly, it's a real cliche, but no day really is ever the same. So I might be working with a founder on a one-off project, or it might be helping them solve something very, very timely, like, something's on fire in the press, for example, and they want help talking to that journalist. A lot of founders might need external help on things maybe where they don't have the same strength. So I spend a lot of time meeting external advisors, go-to-market specialists. I also do a lot around ecosystem and community building. So I'm building out, the more long-term plans of like European initiatives that help build community with our founders. But my role, honestly, is super broad. And Lightspeed's very, very fortunate in the fact that we're a global platform. So we have an incredible early stage launch program in the US, which helps pre-seed, seed stage founders, which is phenomenal and really can, there's a lot of playbooks which really can translate no matter what sector you're building in. And they, a lot of the challenges are very, very similar. We also have a world-class talent team in the US, and I can bring them in to as and when they're needed, and they can really help bring in the best advisors and help advise on how to build their teams. So I'm kind of an extension of a broader team, but also there's day-to-day stuff where I can actually help them. But I think you mentioned how does the role of platform also help the firm and the wider fund? But honestly, I think, as I said before, if our founders are winning, the firm's winning. It's that simple.
That's awesome. You can see why both funds are so well respected and highly sought after to get investment from, because when you have that level of support, you definitely have an upper hand. So it's really cool to hear about it. I guess just thinking about people listening to this that are kind of getting incredibly inspired by hearing your stories and very jealous of the breadth of your role and the impact you're having. What, in your opinions, are the most important skills and traits that someone needs to have to be successful in this role? So I guess the sorts of people that you think would be best suited to a platform role. Leah, I would love your thoughts. And then Charlotte, if you don't mind adding, that would be amazing.
Sure. I mean, I think, again, it sounds like I'm beating this drum over and over. It's just a relationship builder. So someone who really values community and has just that magic ability to build it. I think that's incredibly important. I think secondarily, it's being really comfortable with ambiguity. So if you need a well-defined role, if you need to understand what you do every day, if you need someone to pat you on the back and say, job well done, this is not the job for you, right? Because it is, it's not an obvious, success is not always obvious. And I think that can be really hard. And I think if I was earlier career, I don't know that I could do this job, because it just, you're so nervous about, am I doing it right? Or am I doing it wrong? Or am I doing the right thing? And no one is going to tell you, right? If you're doing, you sort of have to find your own way. And I think that, people will give you a nudge here and there, and certainly you can get feedback if you ask for it, but you really do have to be sort of a self-starter. But ultimately, someone who cares deeply about people and building relationships is going to be the thing that's going to make the biggest difference.
I couldn't agree more on the being comfortable with ambiguity. And one of the things I was going to say was adaptability, which, to be honest, is the same thing. We've just both talked about our roles. You're wearing so many hats. You've got to be constantly comfortable with context switching. The only thing I can liken it to is having 20 tabs open on your computer at any one time. It's like that in your brain, because you're doing so many different things and working with different investors. We haven't really talked about that. That can vary hugely. So you've got to be a real chameleon. You've got to be adaptable. Those are critical skills to build relationships. I'd also say a bias to action and problem solving. You really have to, and that's kind of, again, to your point there about thinking about making things happen, and they're going to come to you with all sorts of things, and you have to think really quickly. And often you're not necessarily the right person to solve it. So you have to bring in the right person to solve it. So you have to be that kind of self-starter, I think. That's as you said.
That's a great word for it. I think the other thing that is acting with conviction. So this was, I think for me, coming from an operating role where, especially when you're the HR leader on a leadership team, you're very much about how do you get consensus and get, you can be my natural style is one of conciliatory consensus building. Whereas VCs, when you're going to make an investment, what matters most, you've got conviction, man. You're in it. And so I was like, well, we could do this, or we could do this, and I realized it was like, and things I was super passionate about, but it wasn't coming across that way because I wasn't used to sort of pounding the table that way. So I think you also have to really show conviction in those things that are not, not obvious. And you're like, no, this is the right thing for our founders. So we should be doing this. I am the expert here. This is what we should be. But it like, that is not necessarily a natural, like when you're coming from an operating role, because you're like, you have to drive agreement in a different way. But I think really having conviction about what you think is right is massively important. So I would say, like, strong opinions loosely held, because you might get knocked off that, but you do have to go in with that strong opinion.
I don't know about you, but I certainly learned to have conviction by watching sometimes the investors, and I think that's something earlier in your career you wouldn't necessarily have the confidence to do. So I would definitely urge, if you're thinking about a move into VC earlier, to do an operating role first, because you need that confidence, that self-belief, and even just like having conviction, maybe when you've got a niggle in your head, acting with conviction.
Yeah.
Yes.
They don't need to know that.
No, exactly.
This is such great advice. Thank you both so much. I guess on the flip side of that, we've talked about all the brilliant parts of this role, but what are the gnarliest, most annoying, challenging bits? Because this podcast is not just about all the fun stuff. We've got to be honest about the harder parts. So what do you find difficult, and what should people have their expectations managed about the difficulties? Charlotte, why don't you kick us off?
So I don't know whether I should say this is a difficult part, because it's a good thing. One of the things that struck me instantly was the intellectual ability of our founders. And honestly, it's keeping up with them intellectually. And full transparency, there's no way I can do that, which is, we're investing and we're working with some of the brightest minds in the world. So the concepts, and the breadth of the concepts, deep tech, health tech, fintech, and beyond, it's so complex. And the technology is often, totally mind-boggling. And for me, ChatGPT is often my encyclopedia. I'm constantly checking what an acronym means, or and in a company presentation. But that's also, on the flip side, that's why I started this, was saying it's also a huge positive, because to get exposure to the future every day is pretty insane, but you've got to be prepared to feel very stupid. Because, I don't know, stupid is the wrong word. I don't know a better word. It sounds a bit derogatory, but these really are the brightest minds in the world. And I'd say that too about many of the investors I'm working with at Lightspeed. And that has been incredible for me, because they're very specialist. At Lightspeed, they work in sectors, so they really go deep on their subject. And they truly are subject matter experts. And that has been really incredible. But you have to, sometimes you have to be very comfortable with the skill set you can offer, and just know that maybe intellectually it's going to be different.
I completely agree with that. I think the other thing is getting good at saying no graciously. And so it can be really hard, especially when because questions will come in, and there's a lot that you can do in the role. It's really defining what's highest value and what you should do. And so, Shannon and I will have this conversation where it's like, hey, yeah, we could do that, but is that really the highest value? Is that going to drive the most value for the firm over the long term? And I'll never forget, I started and I was, so eager to get going to founders. And the first founder that reached out was like, hey, could you do some sourcing for a data engineer for me? And I was like, no, I can't do that. I just literally can't do that. I don't know any, I'm not I can't source. I've never done that. But just helping founders understand how to best interact with you and where you can add value for them takes time. And so that's, I think, one piece. I think the other piece is everyone is interested in getting into a portfolio, whether it's on the firm side, hey, we're interested in Balderton, or I'm a CXO and I'd love to be a part of your portfolio. Can we chat? And so really learning how to guard your time, because I could literally go from 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. and talk to people all day long that I'm never going to place in the portfolio. They're really interesting people. They're great conversations. But ultimately, I'm not an exec search partner. That's not my job. And so I think really, figuring out how to say no, especially to founders graciously, let me figure out how to connect you with someone that can do that, but I can't do that for you. And so I think putting up those guardrails in a gracious, thoughtful manner is hard, especially when you're new to role and you're really, and I'm a people pleaser fully. I know that
I think you have, that's one of those qualities that you need in this role, I think.
You do, but it's knowing that, how do you balance that? And so I think you have to really be careful with it, because you don't want to disappoint people and you want to make sure they come back to you. But if you're answering low value questions, you're only ever going to get the low value questions. So how do you then try to move the conversation sort of up the value chain in terms of importance. And when I start a conversation with a new founder, it's like, hey, what are tell me about the next 12 to 8 months. Like, what are the big business challenges you have to solve? And I think that will often it gives people pause, right? Because they're not necessarily expecting that from the talent person or the HR person but again, the business hat is on. That's the first hat. It's just, what's the angle that's going to be helpful from a people perspective?
I love these answers. They resonate so much with me. One, Charlotte, to your point, I think we work with some absolutely incredible founders, and we're often finding some of the most important roles, whether that's a COO, a commercial leader, potentially a CEO successor. And sometimes it's just like, it's hard enough to wrap my head around actually the business model and the technology, let alone just kind of keep up with you intellectually. But it's also the best part of it is trying to kind of learn from these visionaries. I love that. And then to your point, Leah, again, I relate so much because I am a people pleaser. And on the one hand, I want to help everyone. And we get inundated with amazing talent, but there are not enough hours in the day to talk to everybody. And so having to be really selective, and that's where I put them in the direction of other headhunters, or, I try and make proactive connections, but it's a difficult one, but it is important. Otherwise you get overwhelmed and then you don't end up doing anything that effectively because you're just trying to be a bit of everything to everyone. But if I'm honest, to be vulnerable and honest, that is the bit that I still struggle to this day and continually get the wrong side of that. But then again, that's
never easy.
Yeah. And weirdly enough, some of those random connections.
I think that's how you be good at your job, though.
Yeah, I guess so. And that's the problem, because that's what we're sort of known for, is going above and beyond but then it's trying to balance it. And yeah, if anyone knows the answer to that that's listening, then just give me a shout. We've not got that much longer left. And I really want to talk a bit about the future of VC, because you two are probably in some of the most exciting and interesting sort of place to really have a good view on what founders are seeing and what the wider ecosystem is. We have to be excited about. So what are the current things that are keeping founders up at night that you're sort of helping them work through currently? Charlotte, would love to hear what the Lightspeed founders are saying.
I'd say that, one of the biggest challenges, and I think this is at all stages probably, that we see is sustainable growth. And in the past, probably the emphasis was on rapid scaling, but now it's about having solid unit economics and thinking about their business models and the fine line between cutting costs, but maintaining innovation and also talent. And I think, Leah, you can probably say a lot more on that too, but also staying competitive and attracting talent. So I think much of my role is surrounding founders with the best people in their corner, whether that's advisors, board members, and consultants, and helping them in areas where they might not be so strong. And so we spend a lot of time doing that. I think I mentioned before, go-to-market specialists. That's a big, big thing, because there's often this tussle between the intersection of product, being a really great product person, but also being great at growth and sales. And the two, there's when they get to that sort of stage where potentially one is stronger than the other, then you need to bring in or hire someone who can help them in the areas where they may not have those strengths. So that's a lot of the things that we're working on as a firm to support founders with at the moment.
Yeah. Leah, I'd imagine it's probably quite similar, but is there anything else you would add to that?
No, I think very similar. It's that getting back to growth after the push for efficiency, right? So how do you make sure almost to a company, folks have had to reduce headcount over the course of the last 18 months. And there's a real hesitancy. It's we know we need to grow again, but we don't want to make a mistake. And so that then you can get caught up in what's the next best hire? How do I think about it? It can be really paralyzing. So it is a shift, because everyone ran hot for so long, and it was efficiency is the word of the day, and back to unit economics and sort of really good business principles that you should always be thinking about. But money was cheap, and that created some bloated growth. But I think that there is a return to growth, absolutely. But I think thinking about it and trying to be really mindful about how that happens is what we see a lot of founders going through right now.
We have two final wrap-up questions. This has been an absolute joy, so thank you again for sharing your stories. But this is 40-Minute Mentor, so I have to ask, if you could be mentored by anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and why? Charlotte, I'll go with you first.
I don't know if I'm going to be disqualified for not providing a name here. And also, I really hate to sound cheesy, but honestly, for me, I would say I am really lucky, because I mentioned a mentor that I met during my time of having my company, which then led me to different, and he's very much still in my life. And there are several mentors that I have. And so I feel like I can't say one, but I would say the traits are that they're people that are super honest with you. they give you unwavering support, but also they kind of give you energy and a continuous passion to learn. But I do think that honesty, like help you course correct and tell you the truth, is absolutely critical. We often think of mentorship as just like a positive, and that's not necessarily a negative to give you feedback, but I do think that's really important. And the mentors that I have in my life will tell me the truth.
I love that.
And that's not always positive. It's constructive.
No, critical friend. You need that in a mentor. They need to be able to ask the hard questions and call you out. And sometimes I think that's so important. Thank you. Leah, what about you? Who's the dream mentor?
I'm punting a bit too, because I'm similar. I'm like, I can't call one person. I think for me, it's the same. Like, I've got a few people that really know how to give me tough love. And I think that matters. I think about the decisions I've made from a career perspective, and I certainly wouldn't be sitting here today if I didn't have those people. When I was like, I don't know. And when I was holding back and they sort of really could and push, but they were also there to support. And if it went terribly sideways, I knew that, I could go back and be like, well, that didn't really work, but thanks for the push. So there isn't one person. I have, I think of it as like, when you have a portfolio career, I feel like I've got a portfolio of really extraordinary people that I can lean into for different things.
And that is wonderful to hear. And I think actually a really important message that we talked about on the podcast. Mentorship comes in lots of different forms, and you don't need to have one. It can come, well, hopefully from this podcast, but also from different people in your life in different forms who have different skills and experiences. Be selfish with mentorship. Get as much of it as you can, because it can only benefit your life and career. Finally, what is the last piece of advice, whether it's career or life advice, that you'd like to leave our listeners with? Leah, do you want to answer this first?
Sure. I'd say be true to yourself. So if it doesn't feel right, but it seems shiny and like, oh, that's the thing I should do, it's not going to be the long-term answer. So really be true to yourself. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't.
Yeah, I love that. And Charlotte, I'll leave the last word to you.
I love that too. I love that. And I think, being authentic, we talked about so many other things today, but I think be true to yourself, but surround yourself by trusted allies, people that will support you and guide you, because we've talked, relationships and having that community of people around you is so important as you build out your career and you stay on the right track.
Thank you so much. A really inspiring place to end it. You're both wonderful at what you do. I feel it real privilege to have asked those questions today. And I know our audience will have found it super insightful and inspiring. So thank you both so much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you both in person soon. So thank you again. Have a great weekend ahead.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
If you're seeking more stories from inspiring entrepreneurs, then don't miss The Serial Entrepreneur by Startups Magazine, a print and digital publication dedicated to supporting tech startups. In this podcast, editor Anna Wood interviews some of the most innovative startups today, sharing valuable lessons, stories of failure, and a dash of motivational advice. I can't recommend this podcast highly enough, so make sure you tune in now by searching The Serial Entrepreneur, cereal spelt like the breakfast, on any streaming platform, or by visiting startupsmagazine.co.uk.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you found it useful and inspiring. If we have left any questions unanswered, or if you have any feedback or guest recommendations for future series, then please make sure you get in touch on info@jbmc.co.uk. I often get asked by listeners how you can help us spread the word about 40-Minute Mentor. There are two simple ways you can help. Firstly, share this episode on your preferred social media platform, and LinkedIn is probably where I'm most likely to see it. And you can also leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every share on social media and review left on the podcast platforms really helps us to get 40-Minute Mentor in front of new audiences and share the power of mentorship even further. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for even more pocket-sized mentorship.